Hello and welcome to the Language Revolution podcast. My name is Cate Hamilton. I'm a languages teacher and founder of Babel Babies. The aim of this podcast is to get people talking about talking. So without further ado, let's get started. Today I'm talking to actor, author, producer, educator, often in the realm of Shakespeare, Ben Crystal. Good afternoon, Ben.
Good afternoon, Kate.
I'd like to talk to you today about our human need to express ourselves in words, and perhaps even Shakespeare's words. In the previous episode of the podcast, I was chatting to a psychologist, and we were looking at how humans evolve their need to speak based in a social and emotional context, and that we can't look at language separately from our whole being. And I think speaking our minds and our emotions is part of one of our key human instincts. So how can we find the words to express our inner wranglings, and perhaps we could talk about how, if we borrow some words, maybe from poetry or plays like Shakespeare's, that might be a good place to start. So where do we find these words from, Ben?
That's a good question. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you on such a subject. Where do we find the words? I suppose the heart perhaps lights the fire that activates the brain, that makes you speak.
Yes.
And what are we trying to do other than either express how we feel or express a way that we think about something? And certainly from my perspective, I think a lot of my education, a lot of my time in school was spent teaching me things to think, and not necessarily either teaching me how to reiterate or re-express those things, but perhaps sometimes. I can't remember a single moment really where I had space and time and opportunity to learn, to be encouraged, to have nurtured out of me my feelings, I suppose. We often say, tell me how you tell me what's going on, tell me what you feel about this. But there isn't a great arena, certainly in most schools that are strapped for cash to be able to do anything beyond the 3 hours, to give this space and time to encourage our younglings to have the verbal weaponry, I suppose. They're difficult things, emotions and feelings, I suppose, and they're sort of amorphous and abstract, and they're quite hard to nail down, even if you've had 20 or 30 years of experience doing them using other people's words. So how do we do that? It's such a good question. I wish I knew, but all I can tell you is that having noticed in myself and noticed in other people that not doing so can often bring great anxiety and depression, that bottling things up, as they say, or not speaking your heart, or not wearing your heart on your sleeve can make people quite unhappy. And I've certainly personally found a skill, I hope, or at least an ability with words, with speaking as eloquently and as articulately as possible mainly a trial by fire, by getting lots of opportunities to speak off the top of my head in public, which is something I learned from watching my dad lecture when I was a kid, and still to this day. And and from having stabilizers, I suppose, mainly through the works of Shakespeare and other great poets, by getting to, I think it's terribly frightening to be standing on, as it were, the cliff edge, and almost be having someone say, jump, speak your mind, speak your heart, go on, it won't hurt, you'll be fine. But getting to do that using someone else's words, who for whatever reason is particularly skilled in being able to capture the human heart or the human condition in word, and pretending for a moment that those words are yours, it makes it easier, I think, to do it. And then of course, there's there's the other things that we're not very good at, like relationships, and being able to do that whilst under the pressures of other emotion or adrenaline and that kind of thing. But I would love to see more opportunity to get younglings and elderlings to be in safe environments where they feel like it's okay to speak from their heart, to speak with full voice, which again is another massive skill set that isn't attended to. I can only imagine that would make for a much happier world.
So this is called oracy, this speaking. Yes, and it's a skill for life, isn't it? But is it something that can be useful as well as helping us express our thoughts and emotions and feelings? Can we, say, for example, encourage schools to focus on it because there's a skill involved there that is good for careers? Or how can we encourage people to see it as not just a throwaway nice extra thing, but actually it's a very central...
That's the thing, isn't it? It very quickly and easily gets lumped into the same bracket as dance and art and drama, and they're the first things to go when a school has to cut stuff. Whereas these are the canvas and the paints and the brushes from which people can really broaden their heart and soul into and flourish into different aspects of what it is to be on this spinning rock for such a brief amount of time.
And good speakers in any profession, say scientists, who can speak about their work, are incredibly valuable. It's not necessarily, because there's a very big focus on STEM in schools at the kind of cost, I think, of creativity, and speaking and drama tends to get pushed aside so that we can focus on the important things. So I think that one of the important things is learning how to express your thoughts on any subject.
Absolutely.
And speaking is very much part of that.
The focus on, it's the age-old thing that I'm sure everyone has said at some point. When in my future life a quadratic equation is going to be useful to me? And the maths teachers go, oh, well, you'll never know, and I'm sure that perhaps the quadratic equation itself doesn't turn out to be directly useful. Certainly thinking in that way, or exercising your brain muscle to into that way of manipulating figures and numbers, is good exercise. But if the number of authors, let alone the number of artists, actors, scientists, brilliant people, entrepreneurs who I've worked with, who have the most fantastic ideas. They're making huge amounts of money either for themselves or for charity or for the good of the world, but they have no ability to be able to express it. And the workshops that I run with them, they're not groundbreaking. They're simple things. It's storytelling, essentially. Right. I use the same exercises that I take into primary schools with these 50, 60, 70-year-old entrepreneurs that are having to walk into the place that they've built from the ground up, because what they're brilliant at is having fantastic ideas, and they've woken up with another fantastic idea, and they walk into their company and they say, listen everybody, I know we've been making underwater hair dryers for the last while and that's been doing us great, but tomorrow we're going to start making flying umbrellas and I know exactly the way to do it. And everyone goes, what are you talking about? Oh my god, this is terrible. We know how to do underwater hair dryers. This is never going to work. Oh, actually, I suppose, we've done underwater hair dryers for a long time. Maybe flying umbrellas would work. Actually, flying umbrellas would be fantastic. You know what? I know exactly how we can do this. This is brilliant. And then so you take everybody through this, what they call this change curve.
Right.
But what you need at the head of that is someone ideally not standing behind a lectern, not reading from notes, and not nervous to make eye contact and actually connect with people.
Yes.
What people want, by and large, especially in this day and age, I suppose, on the flip side of being able to be able to speak, is to be heard, to be listened to. I think we need that almost as much as we need the powers of oracy, is the power to really truly listen, and to be able to, as this entrepreneur, to be able to go and talk to the people that who are following you, that are working with you, to know that their concerns are being listened to, and that you are talking directly to them rather than just reading the same thing that you could have read 50 times before. These aren't massive skill sets, but equally, a vast proportion of society don't have them. They don't have the ability to. They feel nervous making eye contact. They feel unable to articulate themselves without. I mean, even a 5-minute best man or a wedding speech or something is anathema to most people.
It's a big deal, isn't it? Yes, it's a huge big deal.
And people say, or people say, how do you learn the lines, or when you're acting, or don't you get nervous being up on stage in front of people? And I'm very, very lucky to say that actually I love it, but it takes, well, they say the 10,000 hours to perfect a skill, and it certainly takes experience to get used to the very bizarre sequence of physiological reactions that your body goes through when you stand up on stage in front of people. Your mouth goes dry, you sweat, you want the toilet, you suddenly lose all the lines. People say, oh, relax, imagine the audience naked, all of these things. But if oracy were a more central part of our education, if it was a skill set that we were learning younger on, and we had a world of people that were much better at listening and talking to each other, well, I mean, heaven knows what it would be like.
It would be completely different, wouldn't it? If we don't express ourselves, okay, so if we sort of stem that self-expression and we don't encourage people to speak and use their words, where is that leading? I think mental health is a growing concern in teenagers these days, so perhaps using more and more technology and feeling less and less happy. There have been a few studies showing anxiety levels are on the rise, depression is on the rise. Can we posit Shakespeare as an antidote?
Well, certainly there are a number of things happening to oracy because of the technological revolution. In some respects, it's making things worse. The teen suicide rate in Japan is as bad as it ever was, if not worse. The people or younglings, I say younglings, but sort of mid-teens and younger, aren't talking to each other as much. Now, the positive flip side of that is that sexually transmitted diseases are going down, partly because they're just not in physical contact with each other as much as they used to be.
For anecdote, actually, we were at a dinner with the maths school at my husband's college at Oxford, and his tutor had retired, and I was sitting next to a first-year student, and I said to him, because they were doing some work on the college, that, oh, what are you doing now? The bar is closed while they renovate that area. He said, oh, nothing really. We haven't really noticed particularly, because they weren't congregating there, whereas when I was at college 20 years ago, that was our central place. It was the physical place where we met and connected and talked. And I think there would have been at least a picket protest outside the head tutor's office, but the current students seemed very unfazed about it, and they said, oh no, we're just in our rooms on Facebook, on our laptops. And that kind of disconnection between people seems to be on the rise, and I do worry that if we're not actually speaking to each other, there's going to be a serious change.
It should be celebrated as well. We are talking to each other in different ways, and certainly I left Facebook in 2012, and I lost contact with a bunch of people that I wouldn't have been in contact with otherwise, and I still mourn that contact, but it's not worth going back to Facebook for. And certainly we've noticed in theatre recently, working with acting students coming fresh out of university, or still through university, there was a terrible turn we're sort of calling it emoji acting. In that these young actors had so little experience of face-to-face communication. It's hard to say, but they were smiling like a big smiley face for happy, and they were frowning like a big sad face, smiley face for sad, and their emotional spectrum, as it were, was almost limited to different facial expressions, as if they were copying.
Gosh.
We were calling it emoji acting, which sounds like a terrible thing to say. But talking to them and working with them over a period of time, we discover it's the truth. They don't have an awful lot of that, what we'd call sort of this kind of communication vocabulary. So
like an emotional repertoire.
absolutely, yeah. And certainly combine that with the lack of a sort of an oracy education to begin with, so they didn't have the weaponry either, and add in more than an obliviousness. But I mean, we have Derren Brown over here, and they have David Blaine in America, and those mentalists that can tell who you are and what you do just from what you're wearing and what you're dressed and how you're holding yourself, and body language.
Yes.
Purely and simply, which has so much to do with storytelling in the theatre. Subconsciously, we will read into a character purely and simply by how they're holding themselves or not, and all of this is being missed.
So yes, so that's sort of being pushed away if we're not doing enough acting at school and Shakespeare.
I'm not sure. I want to be careful about, like, whilst I'm an actor and a big fan of Shakespeare, I'm not necessarily saying that theatre and Shakespeare is the route to it. It certainly was for me. Why is theatre useful in schools? Because it's providing. You're often using a space that's used for formal occasions in an informal way. That's fun, just to begin with.
Yeah.
You're allowed to play and you use your imagination, which again you probably haven't had much opportunity to do since infant or primary school, I suppose. And you get the reward at the end of it, which is the excitement of the night and the people coming and the adrenaline shot and the applause. So we spent most of our time doing high school musicals. The revelation for me with Shakespeare was, having spent so much time on stage, one arena, and then in the other arena in class, being, as it were, forced to engage with Shakespeare or digest Shakespeare, or just digest this English literature in a book. And then there was this weird fusion of the two, where I didn't want to do Shakespeare on the stage because I'd had such bad experience of it in school.
Right.
But then getting it and putting it up on its feet wasn't much fun either, because we were doing a comedy. And when you're rehearsing a comedy, the first 3 or 4 times you hear the gag, everyone laughs. And then the 6th or 7th and 8th and 9th times people sort of go, oh yeah, that's still funny. And then the 20th time, no one's laughing.
No.
The firework, joyful climax of it all being smushed together with an audience, that final piece of the puzzle. Oh, this is what Shakespeare's about. It's the arena for play and imagination and getting to speak these brilliant human condition words from your heart, and the audience are in it and resonating with it, because we're essentially, I later discover, holding this mirror up to life. If you are able to track the path from early oracy through to the joys that can come from the fusion of theatre and education in Shakespeare, like the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust Shakespeare Week are doing, like the Shakespeare Schools Foundation are doing in the secondary school, I think they can be great tools and great pathways, but
they're not the only ones.
Well, I think, Dad often talks about the way that we will start by giving things names that can immediately put people off. Like, he's a professor in linguistics. What the hell is linguistics? That sounds terrifying. You talk about Shakespeare and immediately people go, and dare to say the main style of poetry that he writes is in iambic pentameter, and anyone that hasn't already switched off is going to. But if you talk about the fact that every line of Shakespeare naturally fits the human lungs, that it's got the rhythm of the language that we're speaking now and the rhythm of the human heart, and he manipulates that rhythm in order to closely resemble day-to-day non-fluent speech and also break open the human condition, who gives a damn what it's technically called?
Yes. You don't have to start with, this is iambic pentameter, let's break it down. It could just be, let's make it feel human and real and sort of feel it,
Absolutely.
And you have to say it to do that, don't you? You don't. I think
so.
If you're just looking at the words as a reading text,
well, there are an awful lot of people still around that are quite firm of the belief that Shakespeare was never meant to be read out loud. That the public performances 400 years ago were an excuse and an opportunity for him to do what he really wanted to do, which is get it down in print. But as I learned from my father, and blessed to get to work together with him so much. 80% of Shakespeare's audience couldn't read. And admittedly, less than 20% would have been rich enough to support what he wanted to do. So I can understand why one might think he would be writing for that crowd. But it's from everything that we know about the works and the way that they worked and the way that the theatres worked and everything else, they were, of course, held much less preciously than we hold them now.
Well, now they're literature with a capital L.
Absolutely. Literature has claimed them away from theatre, which is part of the problem, I think, that we're teaching it in the wrong school department, if the school's lucky enough to have multiple departments. But these things were absolutely designed and divined to be learnt by heart and spoken, rather than learnt by head, memorized by head and written about.
And you don't have to start with the iambic pentathingy or the unfunny jokes, or you can try and find a kernel of something that's not just what the teacher finds interesting, because quite often we say, we're going to watch this production and put it on a big screen, and
Sure.
the teacher is almost in tears with joy, and the kids are, I've seen them in the classes like, just so, what is this? It's just so untouchable almost.
I think starting with passion actually is a really good thing. Starting with complicated words, whether you want to introduce someone to a field of study and say linguistics and grammar and philology and etymology and all those kind of things, or you can start by chasing down interesting things people are saying, or the way people are playing with language or whatever. Or with Shakespeare, you could start with iambic pentameter, or you could start with Caliban and Ariel and the fairies, But you can't. I think it's a darker or more dangerous pathway, perhaps, to say you'll love Shakespeare because I love Shakespeare, and let me show you my love of Shakespeare. Well, I'm sorry, but your love is different from my love. Your love for a person or the world or nature or words or whatever is different from mine, and I'll be able to appreciate your love perhaps, but it's not going to make me love it.
And you're not going to feel it.
And you're certainly not going to feel it. So oftentimes, if I'm asked, I'll say, I'll rather than aim for a play, you can of course aim for the more fantastical characters and play in the world, but the sonnets, these 154 little parcels of love poetry that are written in the first person. You don't have to worry about plot or character or motivation or anything like that, but find one that resonates with you, and you will. And if you are lucky enough to return to it a month or a week or a year later, you will realize that your life experiences that you've gleaned since first reading it have shone a different light on it, and you realize, oh, actually I didn't really understand it at all. And as they say with acting, you peel the onion and you get further and further and further in, and you burrow yourself in, and that's just one sonnet. Offering that opportunity to a classroom of students and saying, hey, which of these does any of these make any sense to you? And to nurture their love. Yeah. Or not necessarily, but at least to nurture an opinion
perhaps,
about
yeah,
it.
to have an opinion. Because I think you've talked about children feeling uncomfortable in classrooms with Shakespeare. It's just sort of is not great unless they've got lucky, for example, or had a brilliant teacher. Could this in part be to the received pronunciation of quite a lot of the BBC productions, or some of the classic productions that we might be able to get hold of to play in classrooms?
I think
because it made it a bit untouchable by.
Yeah, well, I think there's two things going on there. The one is it's an obscene and unfortunate circumstance in the world that will be ever slow to change, but discovering a way into a body of work that can be so self-revealing and revealing of the world at large, the reason why we're all here, what we're doing, the way that we interact with people, like health and healthcare, and not sleeping in misery or just being in pain generally, and it shouldn't be down to luck. It really shouldn't. And to have empathy for your common fellow on this, to say this spinning rock, it shouldn't come down to luck. It really shouldn't. It's a terrible thing. Is part of the reason why people get switched off to Shakespeare, because it has, whilst being claimed by literature, also, as it were, been viewed as something for the few. Yeah, I think so. I've certainly had that experience of it. I know a lot of people who perhaps aren't first language English users, or come from a part of the world that has a stronger English accent, certainly feel like they can sometimes have less ownership or permission over Shakespeare.
Permission's an interesting word, isn't it?
Because they don't have the right sound, and that right sound has been drilled in for the last 120, 150 years or so as being received pronunciation, but absolutely wasn't 400 years ago. Permission is I think, the absolute thing that, and ownership are the absolute things that come from play. You get to play with something before you learn any of the rules of it. Just sort of, this is the king of the fairies. This is his mischievous evil. Sorry, this is his mischievous spirit, and this is a love triangle between four people, and he's a king and he's a queen. I mean, these are stereotypes that we teach kids from the word dot in their stories, right? To play in those worlds, we do that every day.
Yeah, that's their territory.
Absolutely. And then I remember the joy. I mean, partly it comes from the family that I'm in, of course. There's ping pong punning every tea time, pretty much, and a house full of books, and parents that, well, they listen, but they study what they listen as well. I remember discovering interesting muscular words like populous or something like that. And one of my parents would say, that's a big word for a little man or something, a little boy. And you sort of go, yeah. And they've done, neuroscientists have done studies on Shakespeare. It makes your brain work in a completely different way when you're faced with challenging and muscular language. So there's that play ownership, the permission, the whole thing, to know that your voice is the right voice for Shakespeare, that you don't have to change, and indeed, your voice is your identity, your accent is who you are more than the clothes that you wear. To know that you have permission to do that, no matter what your voice is fundamental, but it's completely the opposite of how Shakespeare's been perceived for the last while.
Yeah, so how is your research into original practices and pronunciation as part of that, isn't it? Has that helped at all to open up the emotional power of the words, or helped people to connect with it more? Is it like when people hear the original pronunciation and you break it down, do they identify more perhaps with the... What's been your experience of
my
that?
Personal experience, the experience of my colleagues who have been speaking it and acting it, and indeed the experiences that we've gleaned from the audiences around the world that we've shared it with, has been uniformly, we thought it was going to be harder to understand and speak. It's much easier. We thought it might be a purely academic exercise. It's in fact much more emotionally engrossing and engaging and captivating than we realized. A bit like the old adage about, if you want to introduce music students to Mozart, you don't give them the 72-page score of one of his requiems or whatever,
and ask them to read it.
You give them the CD. Well, don't give them Shakespeare book to read. You get them to play in it, but also using that sort of music analogy. It seems that we have been, through no fault of anyone's really, apart from perhaps the theatres that have been pushing the sound, we've been retuning ourselves, retuning Shakespeare to this different sound, and tuning it back, as it were, a dial on the radio perhaps, tuning it back towards the accent, the combination of vowels and consonants that they were using 400 years ago. it's almost like it removes the fuzziness. It's almost like you sort of go, oh goodness, that's what it's supposed to sound like, and it is. It resonates with people in a much more profound way. It's really startling to see it.
Can you take us back a little bit then to what some of this accent, this original, Elizabethan or Jacobean English would have sounded like? So people who are uninitiated.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou'rt more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's laseth all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, perchance, or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to they.
It's brilliant. Could listen to it all day.
I can speak it.
Yeah, it's just, it's fantastic. So tell us a bit. So you have been going around the world talking to people about how this original pronunciation, and also the practices as well of playing in daylight, because this Globe obviously is an open theatre, isn't it? People would have been seeing the actors, and the actors would have seen the audience. So how has going and peeling away the layers of the onion back to sort of Shakespeare's original practices opened up like the words and also the theatre space? And yes, tell us a bit about what have been your findings doing this over the last, was it 8 years or 5?
Let's see. Dad first explored it at the Shakespeare's Globe in 2004, 2005. And it was just another thing that Dad was doing at the time. Although, albeit at the theatre that I was in love with, but still. My interest in it wasn't really peaked until the master of movement, Glyn MacDonald at the Globe, came and sat next to him. They were rehearsing Romeo and Juliet for the most part in received pronunciation. They were nervous that people weren't going to understand it. And they were only going to perform in original pronunciation for one weekend.
Right.
And so that, but the effect of the change in accent was so great, they were finding more and more they were having to rehearse in one accent and rehearse again in another. Glyn dropped into the rehearsal for the original pronunciation and stopped and froze. And Dad said, what is it? What's the matter? And she said, they're moving differently.
Wow.
Now you have me. Because I had grown up going to see Shakespeare in the big theatres in the country. And they would be great and it would be beautiful, but they would often be standing quite still and declaiming, as was the style for a lot of the 20th century. And I also grew up going to see physical theatre companies like Complicité play. And they would be moving beautifully, but perhaps not so skilled in voice. And I thought, goodness, isn't there? There must be a way of fusing the two disciplines. So when Glyn said that, I was captivated. And as you say, I've been lucky enough for, I suppose, 10 years or more now to go around the world and explore this sound, this recreation of a sound system from 400 years ago that has gaps in it, because we can't possibly get it perfectly right, although it's sort of 80 to 90% right. And we found that the last sort of 10, 15, 20% is filled in by the speaker of which the speaker's accent from wherever they are. So you get to hear New York-esque original pronunciation, or Delhi-esque original pronunciation, or Norwegian-esque original pronunciation. And so everyone's bringing a great degree of ownership to the sound. It's very individual sound, although you get a company of players from all over the world together and they'll all sound about 80 or 90% the same, and then 10% themselves. If you get a bunch of people together and get them to study original pronunciation and also rehearse the play and block it and everything else like you would in a 20th, 21st century rehearsal style of repetition, of repeating the scenes over and over again, you get a lot of people wandering around making a lot of odd noises that sound a little bit unfamiliar. What has been the biggest surprise, I think, is that this practice, which we're calling original, although it's not and never could or should be authentic, in the same way as the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre that you mentioned is an original practice building, but it's not authentic, and it can't be, with the fire sprinklers and the concrete floor and the mobile phones and the lack of plague. All good things. The sound in an original practice building makes a bit more sense. The sound spoken by a group of actors who have trained as an ensemble, which is simply the French word for together, but an ensemble is different from a cast. They work together differently. And the style, I suppose one of the biggest resonances we have is the rep system of the 20th century, where you would have the same company of actors and they would repeatedly and frequently put on a new play, often every week. Shakespeare's actors were, and these 20th century actors would be together for anything from a few months to a few years, and sometimes their whole career. Now, Shakespeare's actors, by and large, were together for 20 years, working in the same spaces, working with different authors, but continually improving their craft, listening to each other, playing often with each other, knowing how one person will react in a particular way if you throw a curveball at them, and not in a different way. And improvising an awful lot, because they were putting on a new play every day. There wasn't a lot of time to, what we would understand, rehearse the thing. So the nature of Shakespeare's ensemble is, I suppose, what are some of the qualities of Shakespeare's ensemble? Quick thinking, improvisation, playfulness, an ability to play in different spaces, a great ability to listen very quickly, and to say, as it were, as the improvisers say, yes and to anything that's offered to them. Now, if you have all of those qualities and you add in original pronunciation, you're tuning every skill set or every muscle that was once needed to do Shakespeare to a good tuning today. If you practice an ensemble and practice the accent and put it into a proscenio march, modern theatre, you will find it doesn't work just quite as well.
Right.
So I suppose the surprising thing was, perhaps I thought, oh, this will be an accent, this will be a practice that will be revealing in and of itself. And actually, a bit like, I keep thinking, you know that circle you get in Trivial Pursuit where you get the different triangle pieces?
Wedges,
yeah. Each of these original practice wedges are all combining together. And rather than coming together to shine a light backwards, oh, this is what it would have been like. That's the authentic issue that people think, oh, the original practice is people running around in doublet and hose and pretending to be in Shakespeare's time. Well, no, what we've found is that, specifically with original pronunciation, let's say, it's offering a bridge. It's offering a bridge to the future, because I don't think, as interesting as it would be, we've done nearly a third, I think, or just over a third of Shakespeare's plays have been explored in original pronunciation now. It will be great to hear the rest of them. We will find puns we've never seen before. We will find rhymes that we hadn't noticed before. We will find character revelations that we hadn't considered before. And then what? Should Shakespeare always be spoken in original pronunciation? Well, hopefully it's redressed the balance that we must speak it in received pronunciation, this accent that is hundreds of years away from Shakespeare. In the same way, hopefully, people will start to think that I don't want to hear Shakespeare in received pronunciation in the same way as I don't want to hear Tennessee Williams in received pronunciation. But and I think this is the magic of it all, really. You are already speaking with a degree of original pronunciation in your voice by virtue of the fact you're speaking English.
Yes.
You have ownership over some of the vowel sounds of OP. And when I go and work with Americans, I say, good news, you're 50% there. Bad news is I've got the other 50%, and it's the same for me. Well, it's not quite 50%, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So if we can get to a place where, wherever you're from, whoever you are, and whatever voice you have, you feel like you've got an ownership over Shakespeare. And if original pronunciation has been the bridge towards that, then maybe the other side of that bridge is a place where we no longer feel that it's a form of art that has to be expressed with a particular sound. Maybe the right sound finally becomes you and your sound simply and purely because you want to speak it.
So it might actually be, rather than trying to bring Shakespeare up to date for our teens so they can connect with him now, and, you know, I don't know, all the characters have got mobile phones or something, we could actually try and transport them back and see how they can connect their own accents, their own voices, and take ownership of it. And perhaps, I don't know if you could...
I'm not going to go with you on the transporting back. I don't see Shakespeare or any of these original practices as time machines. I certainly see lots of bolted on attempts, in well-meant attempts to make Shakespeare accessible. Make Shakespeare accessible again. You know, those great catchphrases. I mean, how do we make Shakespeare relevant? I know, like you say, we'll give them mobile phones. Or set it in the modern world. But you know, like we talked about earlier with storytelling, audiences are really astute. Even if they wouldn't necessarily be able to articulate why they know that a particular character isn't happy or sad or whatever, if they haven't the experience to register the body language is twisted in a particular way, for example. They're clever, audiences, especially if this amorphous unit is an audience rather than 1,500 individuals. And they'll wonder why Romeo didn't call Juliet and say, "Don't worry, I'm okay," or vice versa.
Or if they had mobiles.
Exactly.
Yeah, it kind of ruins the plot, doesn't it?
Well, it's sort of it's dragging Shakespeare by the beard and ripping him into the 21st century. It's missing the whole sort of point that these things de facto, in and of themselves, are accessible, because he's never writing about what it is to be in the 16th century or the 17th century, and he's not writing about what it is to come from Warwickshire or you know, live in a place where death is much more common on the streets, or any of these things that tie it to then. He's writing about what it is to be human, what it is to be in love, what it is to lose, what it is to be a grief-stricken mother, what it is to be ambitious, what it is to want more from life, what it is to question what life's about. These things are hugely relevant and accessible because we're still asking them today. We don't need mobile phones to make that an easier pill to swallow, but we do need courage and heart and to be brave to... And like we said earlier, the facilities to be able to both ask these questions of each other and to be able to try and form an answer.
So can you give me a concrete example how OP has helped kind of crack open, if you like, street into the emotional, the core of a I don't know, of a bit of a line that maybe people find difficult to relate to? I'm thinking, like in Hamlet, is there an example where OP's really opened it up?
Oh, sure. Well, we found that the actors that were playing the female characters in Shakespeare were able to tap into sides of those characters that, I don't know, I certainly hadn't experienced before. So, for example, Ophelia, who is often seen as being quite passive and quite... at Hamlet's beck and call and whim, and sort of a puppet that's pushed around by everybody. The groundedness that comes from original pronunciation, which predominantly comes from the I sound, the first person pronoun. The centre of that sound is down in your gut rather than I, when you sort of up here in the voice and the throat, I suppose. And it shifts your stance, and you tend to sort of stand a bit more solidly, and move a lot faster. And I remember both Emily and Meg, who were playing Gertrude and Ophelia respectively, were making really strong, active, forceful choices. Now, they are both strong, forceful and active women too, which is part of the reason why we were interested in seeing them play those parts. But they said that because one of the ways that we teach it and explore it is to try speaking the accent in your own voice. Try speaking the lines in your own voice and then switch to OP. And then sometimes switch back to your own voice, having swum in the OP pool for a while, just to keep checking in on the changes that happen both in your body and in your way of thinking. And they kept saying, I feel more restricted in my own voice. I feel just quite slight and careful and tender and anxious, and with no P I feel more garrulous and more on my front foot and more happy to dive in and get up to my arms. So that was interesting in and of itself. With Hamlet himself, every man, I got all of those things and more. I think he's definitely thought of as being this inactive, indecisive, conflicted fellow, and he became much more active, much more sure-footed, chasing down the answer to these questions rather than sitting back and wondering about them. And I think the biggest revelation was a pun I found. Well, it's not really a pun, but a sound echo in To Be or Not to Be, which is often thought about as being a speech about suicide. He says towards the end, thus conscience does make cowards of us all, and thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied o'er with a pale cast of thought, and enterprises of great pith and moment with this regard their currents turn away or awry and loose the name of action. And I think a lot of people imagine that he's come on intending to commit suicide, which is odd because the last moment we saw him, he said, the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. And indeed, Shakespeare rarely repeats himself, and Hamlet had already talked about suicide early on in the play. He says, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. Something like that. Oh God, oh God. How weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable seems to me all the uses of this world.
So he's already explored that idea.
And Shakespeare doesn't really repeat the same idea. What's the point in repeating it twice? When an audience that's so used to listening, you don't need to say this. You don't need to hit them over the head with it. And indeed, many directors have moved To Be or Not to Be. Peter Brook did it most recently, because, and then the Benedict Cumberbatch one, they did it as well. They put it at the top of the show to make more sense of it. Now, the Shakespeare speeches were an opportunity for the protagonist to talk to the audience. If you think about the character dialogue as being black and white, then the soliloquies are the grey moments, the moments when the characters turn out to the audience and go, help me, what do you think I should do? Do you think I should kill Claudius? I don't know. And it's a sad fact that suicides tell not their best friends they're going to commit something like that. What is he coming out to explore? And I suppose a lot of the interpretations have been, I'm going to do it, I can't do it, thus the native hue of resolution is sicklied over by the pale cast. I'm thinking too much about it, I'm not going to do it.
Right.
In the previous speech, Oh What a Rogue and Peasant Slave Am I, he says, he's talking about how the player has gotten so worked up, the player king's gotten so worked up about Hecuba. And Hamlet gets upset with himself for not being able to get himself built up to the same degree of upset and emotion about something so personal as Claudius. And he asks the audience, am I a coward? Who breaks my patercos because I'm allowed to throw up his deeds to the lungs? Huh? He says. And when I saw Mark Rylance do this at the Globe, he said, huh? And he waited, and he wouldn't continue until someone in the audience went, yeah, you are a coward. And the next line is, yeah, I should take it, for it cannot be, but I am pitching them. So there's the idea, as throughout Shakespeare, that there's opportunity for the audience to respond. Now, coward in original pronunciation is pronounced cord. Am I a cord? And in the folio, it's capitalized. And I noticed this because I was using the first folio text because I'm a geek. Because it's the edition edited by two of his actors, closest to Shakespeare. And I thought, I've seen that word capitalized somewhere else. And it's in To Be or Not to Be. Those consciences make cowards, cords of a soul. And I thought, hang on. Maybe this To Be or Not to Be speech isn't a suicide attempt. Maybe this is him hearing that this audience member has called him a coward, that they don't understand life and death the way that he does. He says, the spirit that I have seen may be the devil. Yea, and perhaps out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. So the ghost of his father could be the ghost of the walking corpse of his father, or it could be the devil sent in disguise to tempt him to evil. Now, he doesn't necessarily believe in life and death. He studied philosophy at Wittenberg with Horatio, but he has to acknowledge the fact that if he kills Claudius and Claudius is innocent, if hell exists, he could be going to hell.
Yeah.
So if you thought about life and death the way that I do, audience, then you would think me a coward too. So conscience thinking in this way makes cowards of us all. And that was such a revelation for me, just from those two sounds, connecting them together and going, oh, these aren't separate speeches. In some respects, for me, to be or not to be was a continuation of
Yes.
the previous one, a sort of explanation to the audience saying, no, trust me, go with me, we're nearly there, I will do it, but the reason that you think I'm being indecisive is because...
So he's making you actually engage with that really lofty philosophy, isn't he? But, bringing in, the audience is being asked to put themselves in his position. Well, think about this philosophical debate and the wranglings of it. So it's actually...
Do you know, that's I think the thing that makes it accessible more... In and of itself, Shakespeare is accessible because as Hamlet says with the player, all they're really trying to do is hold the mirror up to life and go, do you ever think about this? Do you, you theatre-paying audience who are fined if you don't go to church every week,
Yes.
who are expected to believe in God, do you ever think about what happens after life? You know, it's a question that we will never, ever answer. And the fact that he dared to ask this audience, who were supposed to be so devoutly religious, to pop that question into their heads was so generous. He's the most generous author. He's the most generous playwright of that time. I know he's the most generous playwright I've ever experienced because of that incredible generosity of thought that makes him universally accessible, I guess.
Yeah, and it's helping to sort of build some empathy as well, isn't it? Because you're thinking, like, how is this other person feeling? And I think you've talked before about how performing Shakespeare can promote empathy.
Well, again, with the neuroscientist research of recent years, theatre in general does. We have these things apparently called mirror neurons, which basically means, on some level, if you witness me laughing out loud and being very happy, a bit of you feels exactly the same.
Right.
And likewise, if you see me grieving and really upset, a bit of you grieves. And the degree to which we have empathy, we are empathic, is greater or lesser depending on how much nurture or life experience or education or whatever things it is that brings that out. But Bear Grylls said just recently in the press, empathy is a learned trait. We can teach it, we can encourage it. To know that empathy is something that essentially is inherently in all of us, in these wonderful mirror neurons. That's a wonderful and great thing for school and education anyway, but it certainly means that there's something special about the theatrical environment. And it's not just theatre. I was sitting around a fire the other day on a beach, and people started telling stories as their eyes drifted into the fireplace. We've been sitting around places, talking to each other and telling stories to each other since we knew how to make fire.
It's just what humans do.
It's just what humans do, and there's a bit of us that is evolved, I guess, that is genetically predisposed towards that experience. So, as big a Shakespeare fan as I am, I must be truthful and say it isn't just Shakespeare that's good at it, but it's the value of oracy, the value of storytelling, the value of listening, and the value of allowing what's being said to affect you. It's priceless.
It is. Thank you so much, Ben. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Kate.